All right, gang. So we are entering now into our last segment of week number one. Hopefully, you had a chance to take a listen or take a look at that 9-minute video on surveying, and we have a better idea of this first sort of attempt of George Washington to go out into the real world, and he's going to use this surveying as a means to sort of step off into what he really wants to do, and that's to soldier in the British Army, right? And in fact, there was a point at which Washington was extremely close to becoming part of the British Navy. And it was only a last-minute intervention by his mother, Mary Ball Washington, who will sort of be intertwined with Washington at various points, and will be the every bit the part of the overbearing mother. At one point, while Washington's in the American Revolution, Mary goes to the Virginia state legislature and tells them that Washington has left her destitute and that she needs a pension. And so Washington, of course, this is not true and is embarrassed by it and has to go and say no. And then he has to go to his mom and say, "Mom, what are you doing? You're killing me." Right? And so Washington will take every advantage of that opportunity as a surveyor to try to fulfill that ambition that he has. And there's always going to be sort of a chip on his shoulder because the British regulars will always look down their nose at the state militias, at sort of the Continental Army, right? And that will be a hurdle that Washington can't overcome until eventually there's their independence won, right? So let's take a look at Washington's involvement in the French and Indian War, and we'll get a better idea of what we're looking at there. All right. So let me share my screen with you. Okay. Good. All right. So when we look at George Washington's involvement in the French and Indian War, we can look at it really as a three-act play. The first act will play out in 1753, and it will be a journey to the French commandant at Fort Le Boeuf. Now, this is Washington delivering a message from the governor of Virginia, basically saying to those French soldiers who were at Fort Duquesne, right there on the forks of the three rivers, the Monongahela, the Susquehanna, and the Ohio, right, that they need to leave that area. That's British area, when in fact it's contested, okay? And then Act 2 will have 1754, when Washington returns, and on his way back, there's this incident that takes place at a place called Jumonville Glen, and we'll talk about that, which requires Washington to then build this fort called Fort Necessity, and will ultimately lead to the first of Washington's defeats, right? And then the third act of this sort of three-act play of him in the French and Indian War is when he's part with the British military, but as a state militia officer with the Virginia militia, and they're routed by the French, and called the Battle of Monongahela, right? So there are a couple of video links that I'll have with this. One video link will sort of look at Washington's involvement in the French and Indian War. It's about a 10-minute video clip. The other video clip will take a look at Washington's leadership and some of the failures that he had during the French and Indian War and how he learned from them moving on, because I think that's important to know as we see Washington evolve throughout this 5-week process. He's learning from those mistakes that he previously had, right? So what you see here is a map of the 13 British colonies and beyond into the western frontier. And what you notice is that these are your traditional Atlantic British seaboard colonies, right? And then if we look right in this area here, right, this is modern day Pittsburgh, okay? Here's Fort Duquesne. So this was an area that was contested, right? Now, French basically had the western frontier where they did a lot of fur trapping, and that was a huge economy for them. Right? And then there was this contested area, and this is where Washington in 1753 is delivering the message, right? In which he's telling the French that they have to abandon this fort because it's land that's been claimed by the British, okay? And so essentially he's dismissed out of hand and sent back, and it's on his return that we get some of the first action of Washington as a soldier, right? So this first act takes place in 1753. The whole reason that Washington, and you can see him here resplendent in his Virginia militia uniform, right? The whole reason Washington is tasked with this, because he's young, right? He's only but 21 at this point. And so it's his role as a surveyor that earned him this ability to go and deliver this message, because he knows not only the western frontier of this area so well through his surveying, but he also is familiar with the Native Americans that inhabit the area as well too, and can safely navigate and guide his way to Fort Duquesne and back, right? So he's kind of like a natural individual to lead this first message, right? He comes back empty-handed. But there is one event that needs to be understood when we talk about the providential protection of Washington, right? And I'm going to reference this as well because obviously there's no required reading in this course, but I'm going to put down things that I've read that have been very helpful. And there's a book by Peter Stark called Young Washington. And in that book on page 77, which we're talking about here, and this is actually the cover art of his book as well. There's a young George Washington with Christopher Gist, right, who's another frontiersman. And the two of them are on the way back from delivering the message. It's getting on late in November. The water is freezing, and Washington falls off the raft, right? And he has a limited amount of time in these swift currents to get back onto the raft before hypothermia kicks in. And he was almost at that limit where he wasn't going to make it when he's able to get back. But then he has to endure the freezing temperatures and being wet and being submerged, and comes out of this sort of unscathed when he could have very easily have perished at this event in 1753, right? And this is a little known event that I had not heard about until I read the book Young Washington as well, right? So that's an important thing from this first act, right? And then we get to Act 2, 1754, and this is where Washington really gets sort of his first example of what it is to lead men. Okay, he is sent back, and he's going to lead a force of British forces that are going to build their own fort at the forks of the Ohio, right? And so as he's making his way, there was a French detachment that they sort of found coming. The French detachment's coming from Fort Duquesne. Washington's heading up, right? And he comes up with this French detachment, and there's a fear that this French detachment is just a sort of vanguard or just a small sampling of what's behind them, right? They're thinking that the whole French army is coming towards them. So Washington makes the decision to attack, and it wasn't even Washington's decision. He was with a group of Native Americans, and things got out of hand very quickly, and Washington sort of lost control. And a lot of these French soldiers were killed as they were trying to retreat, and Washington couldn't stop it. And so he understands that what is happening is wrong, and it's not part of the gentlemanly conduct of war, but he doesn't have the ability to stop it, right? And moreover, what happens is that these few French soldiers who were able to escape go back to Fort Duquesne to tell of what happened. Now the entire French force is coming after them, right? So Washington is forced to create this sort of makeshift fort called Fort Necessity, which is not nearly enough to protect them. And he is forced to surrender, right? And essentially by surrendering, he signs a pact that's written in French that he doesn't fully understand or wasn't translated to him correctly, in which he takes complete responsibility for all of the actions, and it's on his shoulders. And so this gets out, and it basically word gets back to England that with this event, the French and Indian War has begun. So Washington, in essence, starts the French and Indian War, right? And here's the kicker of it all. This French detachment was just a sort of a group delivering a message to Governor Dinwiddie the same way that Washington was delivering the message. There was no malice, or there was nothing coming behind them, right? So mistakes abound in this Act 2 as far as Washington, and he's forced to surrender and is completely experiencing his first military failure, right? But he learns from that, right? And this leads us into Act 3, which is the defeat of Bulldog Braddock was his name, right? So the British force is marching their way to Fort Duquesne. Washington understands that the road that they are taking is leaving them way too exposed to either French attack or Native American attack. On several occasions, he makes a suggestion to turn back, or to take a more covered route, safer route. And Braddock sort of thumbs his nose at him and says, I'm not really going to be listening to Virginia militia today. So thank you, but no thank you. Go back in line, right? And then when it does happen that Native Americans and the French sort of ambush this British force, right? Braddock's army quickly deteriorates into chaos. Braddock is shot and killed. Washington has to sort of take over command. And there is this poise and this presence that he feels, right? And he writes to, I believe, his brother or a relative at some point, and he says that, I've heard the whistle of bullets and I found it intriguing, right? There's an adrenaline with that, right? And when we talk about this providential protection in this battle, Washington has bullets pass through his coats. He has horses shot from underneath of him, but he doesn't himself get shot, right? And while this is a sounding defeat, again, for the group that Washington was part of, it's sort of the building and the foundation of the general that Washington is to become, right? So this whole idea of him in this French and Indian War is sort of molding the military man that he is to become, and molding it by the multiple failures that he experiences during the French and Indian War as well. All right. So here's what I would like for you to do now is to go ahead and click on the links that I have for you on the French and Indian War. And then when you're done that, come back, we'll close it up and we'll set up week 2.